I used to think the worst sound in the world was a smoke alarm going off at 2 a.m. I was wrong. The worst sound is your own wife's phone ringing on the nursery dresser while you're rocking your daughter to sleep, and a voicemail plays out loud by accident. It was 40 seconds long. It took me one listen to understand everything. It took me the rest of my life to accept it. If you're new here, welcome. Tonight's story is about a man who found out the truth the hard way and did something about it the right way. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if this story pulls you in, hit subscribe now, because you will not want to miss how this one ends. Let me back up. My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm 33 years old. I work as an electrician for a contracting company outside Denver, Colorado. Up until one particular Thursday night in October, I thought I had a good life. A steady job, a house with a small backyard, and a wife I loved more than anything, Michelle. Michelle and I met at a mutual friend's barbecue almost 6 years ago. We got married at a small chapel outside Boulder, nothing fancy, just close family. She works as a project coordinator for a real estate development firm downtown, a company called Whitmore Cole. Good salary, good office, and a boss named Richard Cole, one of the actual partners at the firm. For months before that Thursday, we had our daughter, Sophie Ann Reyes, 6 pounds, 11 ounces, born at 2:50 in the morning at St. Joseph Hospital. I held her before Michelle even finished recovering from the epidural fog. I remember her tiny fingers wrapping around my thumb, and I remember thinking, this is the best thing that has ever happened to me. Sophie had green eyes. Bright, almost hazel green. Nobody in my family has green eyes. My mother has brown eyes, my father has brown eyes, my 2 brothers, brown eyes. Michelle's family, same thing, all brown. I asked our pediatrician about it at the 1-month checkup, a woman named Dr. Patel. She told us newborn eye color can shift for up to a year, and greenish tones aren't unusual even in brown-eyed families, if there's a recessive gene somewhere down the line. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. I took 10 weeks off using a mix of paternity leave and saved vacation days. I want you to understand what those 10 weeks looked like, because it matters for what comes next. I was the one waking up at 3 a.m. for the bottle Michelle pumped before bed. I was the one who figured out Sophie only stopped crying if you walked her in slow circles around the living room, never side to side. I repainted the nursery myself on a weekend, soft yellow, because we didn't know the gender in advance, and yellow felt safe. I wasn't doing it for credit. I loved that little girl from the second the nurse placed her on my chest. Michelle went back to work after 7 weeks. She told me the firm was in the middle of a huge commercial development deal, and they needed her back early. Richard Cole, her boss, had her working long hours, sometimes staying past 8 p.m. A few times she stayed over near the office because of early morning site visits. I didn't love it, but I trusted her. I trusted Richard too, honestly, because he and his wife, Denise, had come to our housewarming dinner the year before. Denise brought a homemade apple pie. I remember because Sophie wasn't born yet, but Michelle was already pregnant, just starting to show, and Denise kept saying how excited she was to meet the baby. That's who Denise Cole was to me. A kind woman with a pie dish and warm eyes. Hold on to that, because it matters later. Thursday, October 9th. Cold that day. That early fall Colorado cold where the wind cuts through your jacket. Michelle had a client dinner. She said, last minute, mandatory, Richard needed her there. Could I handle bedtime alone? Of course I said. I always said of course. I was in the nursery around 7:40 p.m., rocking Sophie in the glider chair, and Michelle's phone was charging on the dresser because she'd forgotten to take it. She'd left in a rush after work and swapped bags. It rang. Loud, because the ringer was still on from earlier that day. I saw the name on the screen, Richard. I wasn't planning to answer it. But it kept ringing, and then it stopped, and a second later, a voicemail notification popped up, and, because her phone was linked to the smart display in the nursery, a stupid feature she'd set up months ago to play lullabies remotely, the voicemail auto-played out loud through the little speaker. 40 seconds. A man's voice, relaxed, familiar in a way that made my stomach drop before my brain even caught up. Hey, it's me. Listen, Denise is asking questions again about the hotel charge from last month. I told her it was a work thing, but she's not buying it. We need to talk before Friday. And hey, I saw the picture you sent. She's got your eyes, but honestly, in that one shot, she's got my mother's nose. It's uncanny. Anyway, call me back. I sat there with Sophie asleep against my shoulder, and the room got very quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears. She's got my mother's nose. I didn't wake Sophie. I laid her down slow, careful, in the crib, the way you'd set down something breakable. Then I picked up Michelle's phone. It wasn't locked. She'd used the same 4-digit code since we started dating, our anniversary month and day, and some part of me, some cold and steady part one didn't know I had, typed it in without hesitating. I opened her messages with Richard. The thread went back almost a year and a half before Sophie was even conceived. I'm not going to read you every line tonight. Some of it I've never repeated out loud, not even to my own brother. But I'll tell you the shape of it. There were messages about hotel stays that weren't in her actual work calendar. There was a message from Richard 11 months before Sophie was born that said, plain as day, if it's a girl, we'll figure out what to tell everyone later. Nobody needs to know right now. There was a message from Michelle 6 weeks after Sophie came home from the hospital that said, he asked about her eyes again. I told him it runs in my family somewhere. He believed it. He, being me, being talked about like an obstacle in a spreadsheet. They weren't planning to tell me. They were planning to wait. Wait until Sophie was older. Wait until Richard's marriage ran its course. Her words, not mine. There was an entire future being drawn up in that thread, and my daughter was in it, and I wasn't. I didn't cry. I want to say that honestly because it surprised me too. I thought I'd shake or throw the phone across the room. Instead, I felt still. Still like the air right before a storm hits. I photographed every message, one by one, in order, timestamps included, so there'd never be a question about when things happened. My hands weren't steady, but I forced myself to go slow anyway. 41 screenshots. Then I did the one thing that didn't feel like revenge. It felt like just moving the truth from one house to the house it actually belonged in. I found Denise Cole's number in my own contacts, saved from the housewarming dinner. I sent her all 41 screenshots and one line underneath. I think you already suspect. Here's the proof. I put the phone back exactly where it had been charging. I didn't call Michelle. I didn't text her. I walked back into the nursery, sat down in that yellow-painted room, in the glider chair I'd picked out myself, and I held my daughter while she slept. And for the first time in 4 months, I really looked at her face. Green eyes. A nose that, now that I let myself see it, didn't look like mine or Michelle's at all. I didn't examine it any further than that. I just let it sit in my chest, next to her, and I rocked her, and I waited. It took 26 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall go from 8:02 to 8:28, and in those 26 minutes, I didn't feel like a husband anymore. I felt like a man sitting in a waiting room for news he already had. At 8:28, headlights swept across the living room window. Then the front door. Michelle had her own key, but she didn't use it. Instead, the doorbell rang, hard, twice. I set Sophie back in the crib and walked to the door with my heart hammering in my ears. I opened it, and there was Richard Cole standing on my porch in the cold with no jacket, looking like a man who had aged a decade in a 20-minute drive. Behind him, at the bottom of the porch steps, was Denise. Her mascara was smeared, but her jaw was locked tight. She wasn't crying anymore. She was somewhere past that. Before Richard could say a word, Denise walked past him, straight up the steps, straight past me, into my house. Where is she? Denise asked. Not loud, just certain. For 1 second, some protective instinct in me wanted to say no, wanted to keep Sophie away from being looked at like evidence. But Denise hadn't done anything wrong here. Neither had Sophie. So I stepped aside and let her in. She walked to the nursery, and she stood over the crib for a long moment, looking down at my daughter. I watched her face do exactly what mine had done 26 minutes earlier. She didn't say anything. She just nodded once, like a woman confirming something she'd suspected for a long time, and turned around. That's when Michelle's car pulled into the driveway. She came through the door still in her dinner clothes, purse half falling off her shoulder, and stopped cold when she saw Richard standing dripping wet in our front hallway, and Denise walking out of the nursery, and me standing there holding her phone. I watched her face do the math. For seconds, maybe 5, and I watched her understand everything that had just happened in the house while she was supposedly at a client dinner. She didn't scream. Nobody did, actually, which surprised me. Denise looked at her and said, quiet as anything. 18 months, Michelle. I brought you a pie. Michelle opened her mouth. Nothing came out. I want to tell you the weeks after that were clean and simple. They weren't. There were lawyers. There was a paternity test I requested through the county, and it came back exactly the way I already knew it would. Richard Cole, not me, was Sophie's biological father. But here's what I didn't do. I didn't go after Richard's job. Even though Whitmore Cole has a written policy against partners having relationships with employees, and I easily could have made a call, Denise made sure the right people heard about it herself, without any help from me. I didn't say one cruel word to Michelle in front of Sophie. Not once, not ever. I didn't try to make Denise's divorce uglier than it already was on its own. I just laid the truth out in order, with dates attached, and let it carry its own weight through the world. Denise filed for divorce 9 days after that Thursday. Last I heard, Richard was quietly asked to step back from his partnership role at the firm. Turns out a business partner secretly raising a second child with a subordinate doesn't sit well with the other partners once it's laid out in 41 timestamped screenshots. Michelle and I are separated now. We're still figuring out custody for a little girl who isn't biologically mine, but who is, in every way that has ever mattered, at 3 a.m. with a bottle in my hand mine. I am not walking away from Sophie. That was never even a question in my mind. Blood didn't make me her father. 10 weeks of middle-of-the-night feedings did. If this story is hitting something in you right now, tap that like button. It tells me you're still here with me, and it doesn't cost you anything. Drop a comment if you've ever had to face a hard truth standing in your own home. I read every single one. Here's the last thing I'll leave you with. The night after Denise stood in my nursery, I put Sophie down in her crib and sat out on the back steps for a while, even in the cold, because cold air clears your head instead of numbing it. Somewhere down the block, someone had a radio playing low, some old song I half remembered from my dad's garage growing up. I thought about all those months I told myself that staying quiet was the same thing as keeping the peace. It isn't. It never was. Real peace doesn't ask you to look away from the truth. It just asks you to stop being afraid of it. I went back inside and checked on Sophie one more time. Still those green eyes, even fast asleep, and for the first time in 4 months, I slept through the entire night. If you believe showing up matters more than blood ever will, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.